of the Holy Spirit. Today's readings, particularly the Old Testament and the Gospel and the Psalm as well, just flood us with the image of shepherd. And shepherding, as I'm sure you're all aware, was a common occupation and lifestyle in the life of people both in Old Testament and New Testament times. But not all people today, myself included, know a whole lot about sheep or shepherding. Are any of you here been here long enough or old enough to remember Pastor Elmer Strelo at Bethel Church in Claremont? A few, okay. There was a man to know. Those of you who know him they know what I'm saying there. But anyway, back in the school year 1968, 1969, that was when that's a long time ago, that's when I was the vicar at Concordia in Conway. And Pastor Ed Meyer was the pastor then, and he and Pastor Strelo and Pastor Del Roth, they were kind of like the Three Musketeers. They kind of hung around together a lot. And I remember one time we went to a district pastors conference, I guess it was, and all sort of rode down together, separate rooms, but we got together during break times and that sort of thing. And one of the things that vicars did back then, I still think this is what they do, is they're required to preach, like once a month. Now, again, when you're a vicar, that's your third year of seminary training. So you're still in training, you're still learning at that stage. Hopefully we learn, throughout our lives, but that's where we get our official training. And one thing we're supposed to do is when we prepare a sermon for the Sunday we preach, we're supposed to show it to our supervising pastor to go over it and just to make sure there's nothing really bad in it, and maybe to make some suggestions on how it might be improved. So anyway, we went to this pastors' conference, and I was to preach the following Sunday when we got back, which happened to be Good Shepherd Sunday, the fourth Sunday of Easter. And so I brought along a copy of my sermon that I was going to preach that day. And again, Pastor Meyer, Pastor Roth, Pastor Strelo, and myself, we were kind of together during a break time or whatever. And so I took that opportunity to bring out my sermon and to show it to Pastor Meyer. And so I pulled it out and I started to hand it to Pastor Meyer and said, here, kind of read over my sermon. Pastor Strelo was standing there and he just grabbed it out of my hand. He grabbed the sermon out of my hand. Said, "Why don't you look at it?" And so the opening line in that sermon that I wrote was, "Sheep are dumb animals." and he read, he said, "Sheep are dumb animals." He looks at me, "What do you know about sheep? You know anything? Have you even seen a sheep?" Sort of had, you don't know anything about sheep. And so he read through the rest of the thing and whatever. Finally, Pastor Meyer got a hold of it, got to look at it. But that's the kind of guy Pastor Meyer was, and Pastor Strelo. I mean, we had a good time together, but he was certainly very, very straightforward. And just kind of another thing that shows the kind of guy he was. Pastor Strelo loved to play golf. And so one time I was playing golf with him, and I was not a good golfer back then, and still not. But after a few holes, 3, 4, 5, I don't remember how many it was, but Pastor Strelo said to me, he says, Vicar, I got some advice for you. I said, okay, good, what's that? I'm still learning, I'm not very good at taking advice. He says, "You're standing too close to the ball after you hit it." So that was the advice that Pastor Strelo gave. But anyway, Pastor Strelo was right when he commented on my "sheep are dumb animals" opening sentence. He doesn't know a whole lot about sheep, not at all. But the concept of shepherding, I think, is really pretty easily understood, even by people like me, whose only experience with sheep is limited to petting zoos. Because this is just kind of a concept that is easy to understand. For example, Psalm 23, that the shepherd leads sheep, to still waters, green pastures, really nice places, comforting places, safe places. That's what a shepherd does. So we kind of get that concept, even people like me. And then there's, the parable of the lost sheep that Jesus tells. And he leaves the 99 and goes and looks for the one that's lost. And I guess that one got lost because sheep really are dumb animals. And so that sheep got lost. We can kind of get the picture, too, of what shepherding is like and the relationship between shepherd and sheep by visual kinds of illustrations, too. And I'm sure you've all seen, various kinds of illustrations of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. And the one that always comes to my mind is there's a picture of Jesus with a sheep over his shoulders. He's carrying that sheep. He cares about it, and it is very close to that sheep. In John's Gospel, chapter 10, Jesus talks about, my sheep know my name. There's that kind of close relationship. So that's kind of a concept that's relatively easy to pick up, relationship between shepherd and sheep. But not all shepherds are good shepherds. The opening line of today's Old Testament reading from Jeremiah: "Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord." Now, one thing to understand here is in Jeremiah here and other prophets as well, when they talk about shepherds back in the Old Testament times, they're talking about the kings, the kings of Judah and of Israel, because the kings of God's people, they were responsible not only for the physical welfare and protection of the nation, but also the kings were responsible for the nation's faithfulness to Yahweh, their faithfulness to God. And so the prophets called them, the kings, shepherds. And so the context of Jeremiah's Old Testament reading today and what he was saying, woe to the shepherds destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, is that, and again, you may know this, but of course, after King Solomon, the United Kingdom split into two. It was the northern kingdom, they rebelled, and that kingdom was called Israel. Then there was a southern kingdom, smaller, and that was called Judah. And Israel never had a good king throughout its history. I mean, they're all bad kings. They worshiped false gods. They cared not for the welfare, the spiritual welfare of the people at all. There are a lot of those kind of bad shepherds, kings in the southern kingdom, Judah as well. However, they did occasionally have a good king who really tried to carry out his responsibility for the spiritual welfare of the people and keeping them faithful to Yahweh. And one of those was the king Josiah. And again, maybe you remember a bit of history about him, but prior to his reign, Israel, wasn't worshiping Yahweh, wasn't worshiping God. I mean, they were a mess spiritually. But somebody was cleaning out the temple, and they found a copy of the book of Deuteronomy, and they brought it to King Josiah and read it to him, and he realized, they said, couldn't believe what was going on here, that the people were so far away from Yahweh. Josiah said, we got to change that here. And so he did. He made every effort to try to get back to faithfulness to Yahweh. And so he led the nation in repentance and started out and trying to really bring the people back to God. But then after him, the kings who followed him kind of undid all of that stuff. The following kings were Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, and Jehoiachin. And these are the ones that Jeremiah is talking about, these ones who followed Josiah. Woe to the shepherds, the kings, who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture. So not all kings, not all shepherds in the history of God's people were good ones at all. And even in the New Testament, that Jesus has that same kind of experience. In John's Gospel, chapter 10, and that's the Good Shepherd chapter, when Jesus says this, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand who cares nothing for the sheep. So again, even Jesus was recognizing also that not all shepherds, not all who watch after the sheep, are good shepherds at all. And so, what was God's reaction through the prophet Jeremiah to those unfaithful and irresponsible shepherd kings? What was his response? Again, from the Old Testament reading. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. And of course, that righteous branch was fulfilled in Jesus. And Jesus, who was the good shepherd, the good shepherd king. But in these readings, particularly the Old Testament reading and the Gospel reading for today, the underlying and unspoken truth in these readings, unspoken probably because it was assumed to be self-understood, but that underlying and unspoken truth of the readings is that God's people, in Old Testament times and for all time, God's people need a faithful, good shepherd king. And why is that? Well, again, one of the prophets, prophet Isaiah, in chapter 53, again, this verse is very familiar. It's the reading for Good Friday. But in Isaiah chapter 53, the prophet writes, all we, like sheep, have gone astray. All of us. We have turned every one to his own way. God's people, Old Testament times and for all time, and that includes us, of course. God's people need a faithful and good shepherd king, because we all turn away in our own ways. And so, what is this good shepherd king to do for us? How is he to help us? Well, again, we go to the gospel reading for today. When Jesus, in the gospel reading, says this. Remember, it's speaking of the 5,000, which is kind of in the middle of it here. When Jesus landed, remember they're in boats. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Sheep without a shepherd. And so Jesus began to teach them. And that's exactly what we need as well. We need to be taught continually, over and over again. We need to be taught how to live faithfully and obediently to God. We need to be reminded again and again how to live faithfully and obediently in order to please God and to honor Him, not to earn anything. Again, we all know that, okay? That we don't earn our salvation. Now, that's a gift of God's grace. But as God's people who have been graced by Him, we certainly desire, at least it should be our desire, to please our God, who has saved us by grace. We want to honor our God who has done that. And so we need to be taught again and again and again, over and over again, how to live faithfully and obediently. And not only to please and honor Him, but the teaching that He gives us is a gift from Him, a gift so that we can live a safe and peaceable life. You know, God's commands, weren't given, to make life tough on us. We make it tough on ourselves sometimes, a lot of times. But I kind of compare that like, to traffic laws. I mean, it's kind of a good thing that everybody obeys traffic lights and stop signs and double yellow lines and all that sort of thing. Because if nobody paid attention to that, there'd be chaos and danger, injury, and death all over the place. But we are given God's commandments, and He teaches those commandments to us so that we might live a safe and peaceable life, because He knows best what's good for us. So that's one of the reasons we need a good shepherd king, to teach us, as Jesus taught the people in today's gospel reading. Another reason we need a good shepherd. Again, from the gospel reading for today. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. Jesus, the Good Shepherd here, was a good shepherd to those who were like sheep without a shepherd, because he fed them. He fed them, and he feeds us as well with loaves and fishes. Loaves and fishes. That is daily bread. Okay? That's what our shepherd does. That we need daily bread. And again, you remember from our catechism, again, this is the newest translation, and what I had memorized as a child has been a little bit different here, so I've got to read it for you. In the 4th petition, give us this day our daily bread, Luther asks the question, what is meant by daily bread? And he answers, daily bread includes everything that has to do with the support and needs of the body, such as food, drink, clothing, shoes, house, home, land, animals, money, goods, a devout husband or wife, devout children, devout workers, devout and faithful rulers, good government, good weather, peace, health, self-control, good reputation, good friends, faithful neighbors, and the like. So as Jesus fed with loaves and fishes the people in the gospel reading today, so he feeds us as well. With very physical kinds of things, the things that we need for this life. He gives us the daily bread. But he also feeds us with the bread of life. The bread of heaven, which is basically his word and the Eucharist. That's the bread of heaven. That's the bread that nourishes our life in Christ. And without that bread of life, without that bread of heaven, even the healthiest among us, if we don't have that food, will starve. And if we completely ignore the bread of heaven, eventually we die. But our God also does something for us as the Good Shepherd, and again, this is kind of lifted up in the Old Testament reading again from that reading. Where God says through the prophet Jeremiah, I will place shepherds over them who will tend them, and they will no longer be afraid or terrified. We all know, I'm sure, that there are circumstances in life that cause us to be afraid and to be terrified. They can be all kinds of things. Medical diagnosis, financial disaster, the death of a loved one, circumstances of life all over the place that can cause us to be afraid and to be terrified. And we can go to our God, our Good Shepherd, and pray that those circumstances would be changed. But again, as you and I all know, that doesn't happen always. God, in his wisdom and in his will, doesn't always bring about a healing from a disastrous medical diagnosis. God doesn't prevent loved ones from dying. God doesn't always stop us from making maybe foolish financial decisions that bring us to financial ruin. But the word that we are fed through the word and through the Eucharist, the circumstances of life may not change, but they can allay our fears and our terrors. And again, that is so clear again from the 23rd Psalm, a very familiar verse, of course, where David writes, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Doesn't say he's going to get rid of what can happen in the shadow of death. Doesn't say that at all. Even though I walk through that valley, and we may have to walk through that valley of the shadow of death and disaster and whatever else, maybe more than once in our lifetime, that even though I walk through that valley, I will fear no evil. I won't be afraid of it. Why? For you, God, are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. That's why we need a good shepherd. A good shepherd who does precisely that. Who walks with us through the dark valleys of the shadow of death, whatever those circumstances might be in any of our lives. May not change the circumstance, but our good shepherd is with us. He walks with us through those dark valleys to allay our fears and to allay our terrors. The sheep really are dumb animals. And on their own, they are utterly defenseless. We, dumb sheep, go astray, as Isaiah said, we've all done. We go astray by our various ways of sinning. Sinning, and as we say so often, with thought. And we have lustful or hateful thoughts toward others. We can sin by word, maybe speaking not the truth, maybe speaking hurtful words to another person. We can sin and go astray by our deeds, what we do and that God commands us not to do. Or by our sins of what we call sins of omission, by not doing what our God tells us to do. So we go astray by all our various ways of sinning because we're dumb sheep animals. We're dumb animals. And by doing that, we create trouble and misery for ourselves and for others. And we dumb sheep too often follow the approach to life championed by Frank Sinatra when he sang, "I Did It My Way." The first to do that, of course, was not Frank Sinatra, but Adam and Eve. They did it their way. Don't eat off that tree? Well, we want to be like God. We don't want anybody to tell us what to do. We'll do it our way. Well, again, we dumb sheep, starting with Adam and Eve, ourselves also often go astray by trying to do it our own way, by doing it our way and not the way God lays out before us. Dumb sheep that we are, Jesus is prophesied righteous branch of David. He is our good and compassionate and rescuing and feeding and leading and protecting and forgiving Shepherd King. Thanks be to God. Amen.